Hello, this is Ron Russell, Director for Specialized Services and Supports. At a recent Special Ed Coordinators meeting, it was suggested that a procedural review be sent out for the issue of extended school year services, just to kind of update districts and AA staff on the steps we need to take to make these considerations. So I wanted to take just a few minutes to review the process today. So what is ESYS? With spring almost upon us and summer getting closer by the day, it's a great time to remind IEP teams about the considerations that we are to make regarding this type of service. So ESYS are special education services that are provided to a child with disability that are beyond the normal school year. So these kinds of services are provided in accordance with the IEP. So if needed, if required, they are articulated in the IEP. They may be services that involve specially designed instruction. In other words, they may be needed services that are instructional that would be provided by special education teachers in the summer, or they may be support services that are provided by AA staff. So what do we consider? How do we know if a student is in need of ESYS? In our state procedures, there are four main areas for consideration that IEP teams should discuss. And let's take a look at those. Number one, goal area of concern. So an IEP team should really think about this first off. Is there a goal or goal areas of concern that need to be acquired or maintained without interruption for the child to benefit from a free, appropriate public education? So a team should think about, first of all, the areas of concern, what goal areas they would be, and whether there may need to be a special service provided in the summer. Two, regression. The IEP team must answer this question. Has there been, or is there the potential for, significant regression during periods of interruption that need to be recouped? This becomes a discussion of whether an interruption of special education instruction or support services in an IEP goal area, if that would result in an unreasonable period of reteaching as determined by the IEP team. In other words, would it take an unreasonable amount of time to recoup skills that might be lost if this regression occurs? So this is not, this standard, looking at regression, is not limited to children who have actually experienced serious regression. So the team should look at an abundance of data to get a sense of whether or not regression could be a problem. And looking in some of the state guidance that we have, there is reference to a 9-week recoupment period. So some IEP teams have used that as kind of a benchmark. In other words, would it take more than 9 weeks to recoup skills that may have been lost, or if there was a period of regression? However, that's not meant to be a hard, fast rule. It should be interpreted flexibly, but it is one tool benchmark that a team might use, thinking about defining what would be unreasonable amount of reteaching, and that 9-week rule can be a consideration. So regression is an area the team should consider. They can and should look at past data to determine whether or not a student has lost skills over the summer, and whether or not that has resulted in a significant amount of time for reteaching and recoupment. Number three, rare and unusual circumstances. So the IEP team must determine if there are rare and unusual circumstances, if those are a factor. And one example is thinking through is a student at a critical stage in development that might warrant continuous treatment. So thinking about the standard of a critical stage, one might think about and consider the data that's available. Is there a window of opportunity that might be lost if services are not provided? Teams could also think in this area about would ESYS significantly enhance a student's ability to function independently? They might consider the issue of continuous or year-round treatment. Is that an integral part of methodology that's appropriate to a student? So perhaps in rare cases, a student might require a specific methodology to meet FAPE, and is that methodology in a year-round model? That might also be a rare and unusual circumstance. And fourth, the Department of Education guidance mentions other factors. And that's clearly a very broad category, and you might even think of that as kind of an extension of rare and unusual. But I think the big idea here is that teams are directed to take a broad look at possible needs for ESYS. So are there other factors, special situations that might need to be considered? And mentioned here in the state procedures, page 38 gives you some specific examples of what this might be. I won't read all those to you, but you can reference those. But examples might be considering the degree of the child's impairment, thinking about what their rate of progress has been in recent times, child's vocational needs for older students, recovery time from regression, just a variety of things. So the point here with other factors is for the team to take kind of a broad look at, is there anything unique that needs to be considered as a possible rationale for extended school year services. I think sometimes an error has been that teams have only considered the regression factor, but teams are encouraged to look broadly and think if there are other unique circumstances that might require summer services. So when do IEP teams plan for such services? What about parental involvement? Parents do have the right to appeal an ESYS decision and exercise due process procedures if they would have a disagreement. So the recommendation and procedures is that ESYS decisions should be made at least 60 calendar days before the end of the school year and before any other school breaks where ESYS might be a consideration. And the rationale here is that this would allow parents time to consider the IEP and for parents in schools or parents in AAs to resolve any differences that could arise. So making these decisions at least 60 calendar days before the end of the school year is the recommendation. Now, many teams will already have data to support yes or no for extended year services earlier in the school year, maybe in the fall, and they may have already documented that need. But at other times, teams might need to kind of reconsider this in the late winter or spring. And when they do that, they can amend the IEP and make a decision. But the 60-day rule here is just meant to avoid such a decision being made very late in the spring in case there is some level of disagreement about the decision. Now, I wanted to reiterate that ESYS services are actually quite rare. They are to be considered the exception, not the rule. So IEP teams do need to carefully consider an abundance of data, look at their sources from one or more of the areas we've talked about. There's 4 areas, or there's 4 standards to consider. However, most students will not be entitled to ESYS following these considerations. So we do think of it as a kind of a rare need. And so very few students will actually require it, the exception, not the rule. It's also, and we noted this on the slide here, it's important to remember that when ESYS are provided, they're often different than those services that are provided during the regular school year. So the intensity and the time amount of services may differ. So just kind of wanted to reiterate that ESYS are not required to duplicate services during the school year, but rather if there is a need for that, the intention is for those summer services to, for example, avoid unreasonable severe regression, to kind of address that, or to allow a student to maintain FAPE. But it's not necessary for services to be exactly like they are during the regular school year. In fact, that would be fairly unusual. Usually summer services do look different. And what they look like is determined by the IEP team. So we have talked about the 4 standard areas to look at, to consider. And in the Iowa DE guidance document, and we'll have links to this that will go out along with this video recording so that you can look at that additional guidance. There are some critical questions that are shared. These are questions that IEP teams can ask. So as you look at these, and we'll address them briefly here, you'll see that some of these questions do align to one or more of the standard areas we've talked about. But if teams are struggling to determine whether or not a student does require ESYS, literally asking these questions might be very helpful. And the idea is that if the answer is yes to one or more of these questions, the team should take serious consideration to the possible need for ESYS. So let's look at them briefly here. Will acquisition or maintenance of the skill significantly enhance a student's ability to function? Does the skill represent a barrier to continuous progress or self-sufficiency? Is there significant information that leads the team to believe that there would be a regression of skills necessitating extended recruitment time if ESYS is not provided? And again, I'll mention that 9-week rule has been used as a test for extended recruitment time, but IEP teams should look at that broadly and determine what is extended recruitment on an individual basis, considering what's realistic for each student based on their own disability-based needs. If the student has not yet experienced regression, does the IEP team believe that the serious potential for regression exists? Is the student at a critical stage in development where the window of opportunity will be lost if the student does not receive services? There could be many examples of this, but just one of many examples might be, imagine a preschool age student who's been nonverbal, and in the spring that student just begins to use words for the first time. The IEP team might talk about the idea that ceasing special education services completely in the summer might result in losing that window of opportunity if a student is just beginning to exhibit that skill or some of those language skills. So that's just one example of maybe that critical stage consideration. Is continuous or year-round treatment an integral part of the methodology deemed appropriate for the student? We mentioned that earlier. And then finally, that big broad question, are there any other unusual circumstances which are possible factors that the team should talk about? So just some literal questions that the team could ask to kind of drive this decision making. In some cases, the answer yes or no to ESYS is more obvious than other situations, but these questions can be a tool to use. Lastly, documentation. If there are to be ESYS services, those need to be articulated in the Web IEP. So if a student is entitled, there is an ESYS box on page G of the IEP, which is then checked yes, along with a brief description of the goal areas and the needs right on the IEP. And again, sometimes that box is checked no earlier in the school year, and teams may reconvene in the late winter or early spring to reconsider that, and through an amendment, that box, of course, could change to yes if there is a need. Also, please remember that there is an additional ESYS form within Web IEP where additional details are documented. So if a student is entitled, not only would they check that box, but there's an additional form where the team documents what goal areas are to be addressed, and also the model and delivery time, how many minutes, the role of the person who's going to deliver those services, all those details. And that ESYS form also gives another way to document kind of baseline where the student was at the end of the school year, and the teams can go back in and add where that student was at the end of that summer period. Prior written notice, we know, is a very important legal document that is used to describe changes in IEP services. So just a couple notes here. When a student has been determined to need ESYS by the IEP team, we would want that on a prior written notice, because that's proposing to do something, to offer a service to the student. So we would expect that to appear on a prior written notice. And the opposite, if a parent requests ESYS, for example, and that this does happen, sometimes parents may misunderstand and just think that ESYS is summer school, that many students might be eligible for. But in an example where a parent requests ESYS, but the other IEP team members decide that they are not warranted, that would be a refusal. And so we would document that as well on a prior written notice form. All right, finally, this short video is being sent out via the Special Education Learning Community blog. In that, I am going to add links of these resources, but just a reminder that kind of two sources for more information on the extended school year service process. There's the Iowa DE document that gives guidance, as well as our state procedures document that discusses ESYS in quite a bit of detail, starting on page 135. So please turn to those resources as you need more information. I want to thank you for listening today. Have a great afternoon.